other than, I mentioned East Jerusalem, and other than the West Bank, East Jerusalem is a separate entity because Israel decided to officially annex it into Israel proper after 1967 war. So, but of course the apartheid wall cuts right through East Jerusalem, separating neighborhoods, dividing them in half, and cutting East Jerusalem off from the greater West Bank markets that East Jerusalem used to serve as the hub, the economic hub for the West Bank. So there's a system of the tax structure where East Jerusalemites represent approximately 36% of the tax base of the municipality of Jerusalem, and yet they only receive about, I think, 7.8% of the budget. And this is a systematic discrimination, means not enough schools. There are thousands of Palestinian children in Jerusalem without schools. It means no waste removal. It means very basic things, in addition to the heinous policy of house demolition, which you can read more about at the ICAD website. That's the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. And what this all serves to do is to create what some have called an ethnic cleansing in slow motion. It's not the point of a gun ethnic cleansing that was 48. It's just making life so miserable that eventually people have to leave. It also systematically strips them of their East Jerusalem residency status through these legal structures. Here's one of the shop owners whose shop faces that wall that I just showed you in the last picture. He was describing to one of our delegates how his is one of the only ones left on this street because of the separation wall, right, or the apartheid wall that I talked about. So this brings up the question of what is the economic significance of the occupation? Is there an economic benefit? And there sure is. It has several aspects, which were shared to me by Maya Vint, who was an Israeli refusenik and was working with ICAD. This is the ICAD book by Jeff Halper, which has a lot of great maps and information about this. But Maya talked about the plunder of natural resources. One of those companies is Cemex, or Cemex. It's a I guess, Mexican-owned international company that does mining and quarrying in the West Bank. Takes that, makes cement, and uses it to build the apartheid wall. There's also a lot of dumping of sometimes hazardous waste or just pure waste because there are no real environmental restrictions on what can be done in the West Bank, because of course it's administered by Israel. And then since the Palestinians living in the West Bank don't really have much choice, they're really hemmed in as far as employment opportunities, they're easily exploited by these Israeli companies, not just in the settlements, but the companies that relocate into the West Bank to take advantage of that labor. And finally, the effect of having a captive market, which is an important economic point because it allows Israeli-based businesses to sell low-grade products in the West Bank and for there to be a systemic suppression of that competing economy. This grows out of the neoliberalization of Israel throughout the 90s that you can read about on your own if you like. So interestingly, there have been some efforts to look at which businesses, who precisely profits from the occupation. Now, of course, the settlements do. There are some industries based in the settlements, not just agriculture, and they benefit from the occupation because they get the land and the protection of the Israeli military. But it's not just these settlement products, it's the entire industry of settlements as a whole. All of the companies that build the roads, that build the houses, that provide the transportation, the waste management, telecommunications and security, and the financial institutions that provide the backing for all of this. One of those financial institutions is Dexia. If you want to read about that, I recommend that story. Is really telling. There's also the repression of Palestinians as an industry, the construction of the wall and the checkpoints, the surveillance and control of movement of Palestinians, the military-industrial complex, similar to the one we have here, and even the heinous marketing of these weapons created by Israeli security firms as being tested on Palestinians. It's used actively as a marketing point. So the site whoprofits.org is a great resource for that. I mentioned before that these separation walls, well, they have particular features about them, because it's not just this wall in Israel that is a separation wall. There are other walls around the world. But I ask you to think about what is allowed to cross these walls and what isn't. And what I observe is money, jobs, businesses and factories and trucks freely cross these walls through checkpoints. Essentially capital. And what cannot cross the wall is people who will actually fill those jobs, who will actually suffer the consequences of the dumping of hazardous waste. People are not allowed to cross. And that's what brings me to the comparison with our wall in Arizona. And I want to draw specific attention to a few similarities and connections here. Both walls were imposed by a foreign power on land taken by conquest, displacing the indigenous people and separating families. Ironically, a lot of the same security companies are involved in the construction and maintenance of both walls, the biggest being Elbit Systems as a defense contractor, and there's a security consulting firm called the Golan Group, which draws on its relationship and experience in Israel. It's based in Florida, but that's their primary selling point, is that they use Israeli security training and tactics, and they've been active along our US-Mexico border in training agents. And also both have armed militias patrolling the wall. Here it's the Minutemen, there it's armed Israeli settlers. Of course, Palestinians aren't allowed to have guns, but the settlers walk around with AKs. Just saying. Okay, then I also saw some connections to this new law in Arizona, SB 1070, which is going into effect next week. There is a systematic racial profiling, which in my delegation we observed directly, in that the members of our delegation of 28 people who were brown or suspicious were consistently profiled out of us. There's the outlawing of indigenous ethnic studies, that Palestinians are not allowed to learn of their history, and in fact there's a law criminalizing or stripping any discussion of the Nakba, of the catastrophe of 1948, from textbooks. There's the routine need to carry identification papers with you just to go about your daily life. That's common along both walls. And fortunately, around both, we have now a public call for boycott and divestment until these policies are changed. And very tellingly, the US campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel supports the boycott of Arizona. Which leads to the BDS movement. So what is the BDS movement? Boycott, divestment, and sanctions. This started about 5 years ago, ratified by a majority of Palestinian civil society organizations, both within the occupied territories and in living as refugees outside of historic Palestine. It calls upon international civil society organizations and people of conscience all over the world to impose broad boycotts and implement divestment strategies against Israel until Israel recognizes the Palestinians' inalienable right to self-determination and complies with international law. It's noted that it's not just targeting the state or the people, it's targeting the policies, and this was very carefully determined by the Palestinians who created this movement. And this is also very similar to the strategy used that successfully ended South African apartheid, so it has a track record of working. And I wanted to say about working, how boycotts actually work. Because a lot of us might think that boycotts work because we stop buying something, therefore whoever's selling it loses out economically, that it's a direct link through consumerism. But it's really not. Most of the times, boycotts work by making the target of the campaign into what one might call a pariah, or one who is despised or rejected. basically you link the target through bad publicity and these very public campaigns with a bad taste or an icky feeling that plants seeds of doubt in people who may have otherwise felt no compunction or had no interest in the issue. And it also makes investors and businesses very skittish, and they're much more likely to just not invest there. You know, if it's a toss-up between there and somewhere else, that could make the difference. And it's these sort of ongoing building economic impacts that carry the weight of a boycott movement. And the other big benefit of boycotts is that there's no permanent damage. As soon as the target complies with your wishes, you can lift the boycott and nothing has really been destroyed. As a hint to the power of the BDS movement, there was a quote, I don't want to read the whole thing, but this is from an Israeli newspaper, a Zionist commenter basically saying that there's this soft war, is what he calls it, of the BDS movement against us, Zionism, and he talks about how it's this building, this momentum that builds from one win to another, and the public perception that is the most scary for the target. There have been a lot of victories already in the BDS movement. We're now 5 years in, and it's already much more advanced. It took South African apartheid's BDS movement correspondingly decades to achieve this level of success. And so I want to share with you just a few of these successes. Italian and British supermarkets, one food co-op so far in Olympia, Washington, boycotting all Israeli products. Cultural boycott going on with musicians successfully being called upon to not perform in Israel. Elbit Systems, which I mentioned, the security firm that constructs and patrols both walls here and there, has been divested by Deutsche Bank and 3 Scandinavian investment funds, and many countries severing their ties with Israel. Union solidarity has been growing and powerful. Not to mention the third item there, that the Longshoremen Union refused to unload an Israeli cargo ship in Oakland, in California, a totally unprecedented in U.S. history, labor solidarity with Palestine. And yeah, other unions, the British union Unison, suspending relations with the Histadrut, the collaboration of all Israeli unions. Yeah, so a lot there. Even faith-based organizations showing their solidarity by endorsing the BDS campaign officially. So far, the UK Methodist Church, US Presbyterian Church, kind of close, still needs a little push. But there's actually just some news about that a couple days ago. Just Google. I wanted to also say that it's not just the outside world that is trying here, that is working on the BDS movement. Within the West Bank itself, they are actively trying to remove Israeli products from their shelves, but the extent to which this can be successful is limited by the fact that it is a captive market, as I said. And then there's, within 1948, Israel proper, you have the boycott from within movement, Israelis trying to divest from at least settlement products, now expanding that into the settlement industry, the repression industry that I talked about. Again, that's going to be somewhat limited to the degree to which they can divest from themselves or boycott all Israeli organizations. And there's even an effort in the Israeli government to criminalize BDS activities. So that may not be ultimately the way that this gets won. But fortunately, we do have some boycott campaigns already well underway in the United States. You can find 19 organizations listed so far at whoprofits.org about this. The Motorola, Caterpillar, and Ahava Stolen Beauty campaigns are already well underway and looking for you to join. Academic and cultural boycott, I mentioned. And then divestment efforts also underway. Hampshire College, which was the first to divest from apartheid South Africa, was also the first to divest from apartheid Israel. The University of California has now seen 2 major, I guess, bills brought up, one at Berkeley and one here in San Diego, that were actually the one in Berkeley passed. It was just vetoed by their president. And the one here was very close to passing in San Diego. And I'm told that there's some organizing around that again. Also, this huge retirement fund called TIAA-CREF in the United States. There's an active campaign run by Jewish Voice for Peace, mostly, trying to get them to divest from companies that profit from occupation. So the last point I'm going to make, and leave it to discussion for us to go on from here, is that in the US, where so much of our tax money, billions of dollars every year, goes to fund the Israeli military, the Israeli occupation, the Israeli settlements, literally our silence is complicity. It is being done in our name with our money. And so I have to challenge each and every one of you, what are you going to do about it? And I'll close with the words from Omar Barghouti, organizer of the Palestinian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. His encouragement to us, to my delegation, was to focus on what you can win in your context, that they need victories. So I invite you all to join us after the discussion as well. We're going to be adjourning to the Red Sea restaurant a couple blocks from here to have a discussion on BDS and what we in San Diego here can do. Thank you.
All right, thanks to both of you for some excellent presentations. And after hearing some really devastating and tragic facts, it's nice that you end on an inspiring and hopeful note in talking about this BDS campaign. I know a lot of us in this room are interested in building this campaign here in San Diego, in our city and on our campuses. So people should feel free to talk about any of that. Basically, we have about 20 minutes for discussion. People can raise any questions, comments that they have. If you have questions for the speakers.
I had a question for any of the speakers. I know one of Israel's main reasons for the blockade of Gaza for not allowing like cement and other these materials is to deter rocket attacks. But I know that rocket attacks have decreased dramatically. Do you guys have any first-hand experience of any continuing rocket attacks on Israel since the blockade?
Yeah, so the speakers may write them down and come back on these questions.
Okay.
Whenever they feel it's, we have a few out there on the floor. Go ahead in the back.
Thank you very much for putting on the presentation. I appreciate it. I think one of the things that Americans are not aware of is, well, they always ask the question, why doesn't Egypt help the people of Gaza? Why is Egypt enforcing the blockade? And my own opinion is because, well, the United States has given the Egyptian government a lot of money to do that. Yeah. And I think that's kind of what's missing, I think, from the movement is just the education on, for Americans to say, this is where your tax dollars are going,
Mm-hmm. I really didn't know who the Palestinians were until I went there and spent time in Palestine. And so many of my, and I'm an anthropologist, but so many of my preconceptions and just ignorances were completely shattered by that experience. I spent 21 days there this winter. So when you humanize the person, when the American citizen, the average American, humanizes this person and sees this person as a person and an image and a relationship with their children and their families and their interconnections and how they make a living, how they spent their childhood. All of those things make a difference, and then you buy in and you want to care. But if you don't know these people, you really don't care. And a major part of the problem is the Europeans know these people. They know Palestine. We don't. Our press doesn't talk about them enough. Even our liberal press doesn't talk about what's going on enough.
Yeah.
The dominant narrative here, everything you hear in the newspaper is, well, it's the Palestinians attacking the Israelis, and the problem are the Palestinians and their attacks. But if you remember in that little video, the statistic is that in 9 years, 30 Israelis have died from Palestinian rockets. And in 3 weeks, in December and January of last year, 1,400 Palestinians were murdered by Israeli helicopters, guns, planes, all provided and underwritten by our tax money.
Jason and I were talking a couple of weeks ago, and he was describing what he saw in Hebron. And I would really appreciate it if you would describe that a little bit more, because it really illustrated to me the kind of daily racism and oppression that happens even in large cities in the West Bank. And so and also for anyone else who has visited the occupied territories to kind of be able to speak to that a little bit more.
Okay.
This meeting is quite a bit bigger than the average weekly socialist meeting, and I think that reflects the fact that things are changing around this, as Rebecca was saying and others have said. The Turkish government's attitude toward what happened to the flotilla, their hardline denunciation of that, was really something new. These have been two states that have been very close and alive for a long time.
Okay, I have the gentleman up here, followed by Justin.
Yeah, I have two questions. One is about the East Jerusalem Arabs that are being deprived of their residency. Are they Israeli citizens, or are they not Israeli citizens, and what happens to them after they lose their status? The second one is, to what degree and in what ways are the Gazans actually suffering from a lack of medical supplies?
Yeah, I want to kind of make a point that there is a shift here in terms of how people around the world in this country are looking at this issue, and that this shift is opening up the possibility for actually building a pro-Palestinian movement that can actually win victories. And I want to characterize this as a rupture, because I think that despite the fact that the U.S. media and both political parties stay committed to the Zionist project, that isn't actually maintaining the kind of support amongst the general population that it used to.
Yep.
And I think it has to do with a couple of things, and I want to focus on one, which is Palestinian resistance. It stayed consistent.
Yep.
Under these extreme circumstances, I feel suffocated when I hear about these, the conditions of the average Palestinian, and I feel just completely impressed by the fact that people contain the will to fight, and they use words like joy and hope.
Great. All right. So basically, we're going to turn it over now to Jason and Hani to kind of give any final remarks. Go ahead, Jason.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Thanks everyone for great questions and comments. Appreciate that. Yeah, Faith already took up the question about rocket attacks, and yeah, that always, for me, comes down to a philosophical argument about the inequality of violence.
Right.
That you cannot consider the occupation of an oppressed, imprisoned person in an effort to free themselves morally, or held morally to the same standard as the violence of the oppressor,
Right.
with the boot on their neck.
Right.
I mean, these are two qualitatively different forms of violence, and what I usually tell people is that as outsiders, especially non-Palestinian outsider like myself, I have no standing to criticize the way that a Palestinian living under occupation chooses to resist. They get to resist however they decide best. I might think that a particular strategy is less effective than another. I might wish that they decided differently, but it's not my place to judge. So that's my position on rocket attacks. Egypt, we do need to educate Americans on our tax dollars. Egypt is the second largest, behind Israel, recipient of U.S. foreign aid. And that does indeed create the situation we have of hemming in Palestine from all sides. And that, yeah, our education around that is definitely crucial to winning this struggle. I agree we need to humanize Palestinians. For Americans, The media has done an exquisite job of equating Palestinian with terrorists in the U.S. mind. That's all that Americans think when they just watch the news and there's some news report on Palestinians. Because frankly, that's what they're told to think. That's the way it's always portrayed. I can't blame them for having that association in their mind. And yeah, it is incumbent upon us to humanize them, to tell personal stories about Palestinians that we know here and there, if you've been fortunate enough to go. Residents, it's a special term. They're not citizens of Israel. After 1967, under international law, if you annex land with people in it to your country, you have to offer them citizenship. Israel did that, but the East Jerusalemites, I think wisely, recognized that as one, it would be a recognition on their part of an invalid governance of them, that they were conquered, and they didn't want to recognize the invalid Israeli authority over them. And two, it would have been morally to abandon their brothers outside of East Jerusalem who were living under occupation in the West Bank, and those living in exile as refugees. So it was a moralistic decision, I think, or an ethical decision on the part of the East Jerusalemites to refuse citizenship. That said, they don't deserve what's being done to them, which is they have this residency status, which allows them to be in East Jerusalem, to even travel within Israel and the West Bank. But Israel is using just military orders, essentially, to systematically strip one small group after another of their residency status. While I was there, they passed an order that anyone who was born in Gaza who happened to be living in East Jerusalem with an East Jerusalem residency, overnight you had your residency revoked and you were deported to Gaza. Just totally arbitrary.
Wow.
And the guy who told me about it, who was a guard at a hotel, the patriarch of the house right next to him, his neighbor, was deported